Greetings to all of you who have joined us, the SAPES Trust Policy Dialogue, the first for 2025, and more or less a follow-on to the last session we had on the 31st of October on Mozambique. And we're glad that we have Araujo back, who will lead the discussion. But before I do so is to thank all of you who have joined us, especially our panelists, Araujo himself, Sophie Mkwena from the SABC, Greg Mills from the Brentus Foundation, and Agostino Zacharias. The topic at hand is self-evident, even if, as has happened, the inauguration was on yesterday. The crisis in Mozambique remains very alive, very real. And what we want to hear today is from our analysts, all of whom are well versed in this Mozambican situation, is to an understanding of the nature of this crisis in Mozambique. What are the main elements of it? What is the nature of the state in Mozambique? What has it been? And what is the capacity of the political process, including the opposition, the kid on the block, Mondlane? What does he hold out in terms of a possible reconciliation, a possible formation, maybe something similar to what we've had in the region following each of such crises, i.e. government of national unity? Is it too late for such? I don't know. Someone sent me a note this morning and said, well, why are you discussing Mozambique? There was an inauguration yesterday. And then I saw on X this morning a note from Sidia Chisungo, who's a regular on X. And she says as follows: the worst inauguration in history, an event soaked in blood, fear, and protest. I couldn't think of a better summary of just where we are with Mozambique at the moment. So what I'll do now is to ask Manuel Araujo, our main presenter, to give us an outline, firstly, of the resolutions, recommendations we made on the 31st of October, which were published widely in the media in South Africa, in the Sunday Times, the Daily Maverick, and in Zimbabwe. At the time, we held out some hope for a mediated settlement in Mozambique, a dialogue, national dialogue, in which people like Araujo himself would be participants. Well, Manuel, can you start? Lead us into the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ibo Mandaza. Allow me also to greet Sophie, Dr. Agostino Zacharias, and Greg Mills. I mean, it has been very long that we met, Greg. Nice to see you again. As Dr. Mandaza said, I think, and I will really put my words into his, that when he mentioned that it's still high moon, I mean, this is the right time for us to have this discussion. It's not late at all, given the current situation in Mozambique. So the fact that we had an inauguration yesterday cannot be an excuse for us either to cancel this public dialogue, not even the efforts that civil society, political parties in Mozambique, but also the international community and think tanks should engage in order to help Mozambicans to settle these very deep conflicts. Not only because like every second we are getting messages and pictures of people being shot in different places, in different provinces, and in different locations. So the situation is quite dire, and it needs the attention of all of us. Well, as Dr. Mandaza mentioned here, we met at this place, this virtual place, to discuss the Mozambican election, on the 31st of October 2024. And among other things, the panel actually used the intensification of mediation efforts, potentially through SADC or even the African Union, to facilitate dialogue between Frelimo and opposition groups. It was also mentioned that South Africa or Tanzania or even Kenya could lead or try to come up with a platform. SAPES also indicated readiness to engage SADC to support dialogue. It was also concluded that interfaith leaders, including Islamic leaders, the Episcopal Conference, Protestant Church, and civil society figures should be empowered to continue their mediation efforts with support from the Commonwealth nations and or the European Union. As we all know, Mozambique is a member of the Commonwealth. So we thought that the Commonwealth could be brought in to help with these efforts. Second major point was the need to enhance international oversight and accountability. And under this subject, it was mentioned that the international community should support a transparent review of the election process, publishing polling station results, and also conducting impartial investigation into alleged electoral fraud and assassinations. The third point was the need to boost regional security and to address the insurgency. It was proposed that SADC should consider a fact-finding mission to assess the potential spillover effects of Mozambique's political crisis. Actually, I think that the WISE were invited to set a mission. It was expected to report on the 15th of January, which was yesterday. I'm not sure if these WISE has managed to give back their report. And also, it was recommended that the Mozambican government should address local grievances fueling the Cabo Delgado insurgency, because at that time, at least, it was perceived that electoral manipulation could exacerbate this issue. Fourth pillar was the need for support for legal framework for peaceful protest and opposition. It was mentioned and recommended that Mozambique should be used to uphold citizen rights to peaceful protest as enshrined in the Mozambican constitution, and continue releasing individuals detained for protest-related activities. Actually, just an update, many of them, more than 100, are still detained. And every day, this process, unfortunately, it is continuing as I speak. Fifth was the need to promote political and electoral reform. And under this banner, it was suggested that long-term reforms should be implemented to ensure an independent electoral commission as public trust hinges on credible election outcomes. And finally, it was suggested that the safeguards against partisan influence in state institutions should be implemented, including the security forces, because these should be seen as Republican institutions. So like these institutions, both state institutions, including the security forces, could promote fairer elections and actually reduce risks of unrest and future cycles. And the recommendations on our panel discussion on the 31st of October 2024. Having shared those, I wanted, just as a way of pushing or setting up the scene, start by saying that, as Dr. Mandaza mentioned, the general elections held in Mozambique on October 8, 2012 to 24 have that have plunged the country into what I will call a political turmoil. More than 500 people were killed, including police officers and parts of the public. The deaths of opposition figures Elvino Diaz and Paulo Guambe, police brutality, and the inability of SADC to resolve the crisis underscores the complexity of Mozambique's political division. The return of opposition leader Venancio Mondlane has reinvigorated opposition movement, but also highlighted internal division, particularly within Podemos. The disagreements over whether to participate in the parliamentary swearing in as weak or not, has weakened the opposition's collective bargaining power and actually may undermine unity of the opposition. As we all know, two parties with seats in parliament, namely Renamo with 28 seats and MDM, which is the Movement of Democratic Mozambique, these two parties refused to attend the inaugural and the swearing in of parliament. And also yesterday, they did not attend the inauguration of the president. It must also be said that Podemos attended both, and there were numerous discussions over the internet and on public media about the reasons and the impact of these two antagonistic positions. About the elections, I will just to mention that the National Election Commission, CNE, announced on October 15 that Daniel Chapo of the ruling party, Frelimo, had won the presidential election with 70.67%. Later, this was revised to 65.2% of the vote. Opposition parties, led by Podemos, Renamo, and MDN, immediately rejected the results, citing allegation of voter suppression, ballot tampering, and intimidation by state forces. Independent observers from the Commonwealth, the African Union, the International Republican Institute, the European Union flagged significant irregularities during the electoral process. However, I think I should also include the Portuguese-speaking countries, which is CPLP. However, the observers, some of them, like those from SADC, fell short of condemning the results outright, further fueling public skepticism and opposition discontent. Tensions escalated with the killing of, as I mentioned before, the two opposition leaders, Elvino Diaz and Paulo Guambe. Elvino Diaz was the main lawyer from the candidate Venancio Mondlane and Podemos, while Paulo Guambe was the Podemos party spokesperson. And this happened on October 21st, as discussed in at our previous panel. The lawyer was reportedly compiling evidence of electoral fraud to present to the courts. Amid increased threats, as we all know, Venancio Mondlane fled Mozambique in early November and is now back. And also from exile, Mondlane continued to reject the election result and encourage nationwide protests, which actually turned out to be violent and destroying property, closing borders, and therefore having reported that more than employment may have been lost. The government's response was quite brutal, with security, and actually it is still brutal, with security forces employing lethal measures to disperse protesters. incidents such the viral video of an armored vehicle, military armored vehicle, running over a protester exemplified the brutality faced by demonstrators. The death toll rose significantly, with international human rights organizations condemning not only the excessive use of force, but also the existence of hundreds of extrajudicial killings. It should be stated that there is no death penalty in Mozambique. Well, next, I wanted just to touch upon the failed, what I consider as the failed mediation attempts, both by SADC and also by South Africa. In late November, there were widespread calls for the Southern African Development Community to intervene. The SADC summit in Zimbabwe marked, in our view, a missed opportunity to address Mozambique's electoral crisis meaningfully. By prioritizing historical time, no interference, and with its compromised impartiality, SADC failed to solve the problem, but also to provide a credible management and indeed resolution to grapple alone with its the limitations of regional bodies in managing and resolving deep, not only in our view to Mozambique's stability, but because SADC is a system, a stability in one country may spill over to other. Actually, there are several reports about the impact of this crisis, not only in Malawi, in terms of fuel and so on, but also in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, and in South Africa. So the South African government also tried to mediate the conflict, and President Cyril Ramaphosa sent the former minister, Sidney Mufamadi, to Mozambique. And actually, he met President, but he had scheduled meetings with other opposition leaders who allegedly waited for him, apparently because President Nyusi did not allow him to meet opposition leader, therefore derailing South African attempt to help and to mediate. So the question comes, what can be done? Is it too late? To me, Mozambique at this time is at a critical juncture, engulfing by political unrest, violent protests, and deepening distrust between the ruling party and the opposition. The contested elections of October 9th, 2024 have exposed long-standing fractures in governance, in accountability, and political inclusivity, but also weakness of regional institutions. While the situation remains volatile, there are pathways, I think, to potential manage or even resolve and likely scenarios for what may unfold. We think and we believe that there is still a need for a support from regional bodies and other international institutions like the European Union, the Vatican, the Santo Egidio community, or even the Mozambican Episcopal conferences. But also, there are some university lecturers who launched an initiative to bring together not only the opposition parties with the government in order to find a sustainable solution and a remedy for the always cycling rise of conflict in the post-electoral election. After every election in Mozambique, we have political discontent, we have the eruption of violence that sometimes led to the resumption of the civil conflicts or of a low intensity warfare, mostly the region of Mozambique. We think it's very important alleged fraud. It's such as the releasing of political prisoners, and I underline this because there are people who are detained because of their political stance, and also there are some more Mozambicans laughing of the coalition called CAD, Mr. Daniel, who up to now is abroad fearing for his own security and for his own life. We also think that there is a need to bring an investigation into the election-related violence and the death of hundreds of protesters during the last 4 to 5 months, because we believe that it's very important to address impunity, because for us, addressing impunity is a way to bring justice. We are also of the thought that international experts and civil society organizations should be deeply involved to ensure transparency and impartiality. We also think that the international community and regional bodies should start thinking about the possible economic support to his grievances. Because underlining Mozambican instability are economic inequalities and widespread poverty, and also issues related to good governance or lack of good governance. The international community, we believe, could provide targeted economic aid conditioned on democratic reforms, job creation programs, particularly in urban areas, but also in rural areas, could, in our view, mitigate some of the socio-economic grievances fueling unrest. Labor-intensive targeted investment projects should also be given a priority. In conclusion, and in a nutshell, I want to reiterate that Mozambique faces a precarious future with its democratic institution and social fabric under immense strain. While there are viable paths toward management and resolution, such as inclusive dialogue and institutional reforms, the political will to pursue them remains weak, if not absent, though a document called Terms of Reference for such a dialogue was produced and was given last Tuesday to President Nyusi. And we hope, and that's the hope with a big H, that the current president, President Chapo, will continue with this process and with this dialogue. But also we want to stress that without meaningful concessions by the ruling party and robust international engagement, the likelihood of deeper unrest and prolonged suffering may grow, unfortunately. Ultimately, the question remains,
David, I can't hear you. Araujo? Araujo?
We have lost him, Ibo. We have lost him. I think it's his network.
You. Araujo, we lost you.
Yes, he's left the platform. We've lost him. Maybe you can get in. Maybe we can have another speaker.
Okay. Hi. Sorry about that. I think network problem. We've lost Araujo, although he was about to conclude. Perhaps we can move now. If Sophie is ready. Sophie? Sophie Mkwena. Hi, Sophie.
Can you hear me, Prof? Can you hear me?
Yes, can see you. Yes, can hear you now. Welcome, Sophie. Maybe just to take off from where Manuel left us. What prospects are there for a kind of negotiations after the inauguration yesterday? What do you see as prospects for negotiations?
Well, I think there's still an opportunity to look at this issue by stakeholders and those who can be able to assist Mozambicans. The issue is the stakeholders in Mozambique, are they willing for someone from outside or people from outside to assist them? The other issue is that we know that when the former Minister of South Africa, Sidney Mufamadi, President Ramaphosa's envoy, was in Mozambique, the president of Mozambique, then Filipe Nyusi, indicated that there's no crisis, there's no need for intervention, everything is under control, they'll be able to handle the situation, pushing back. And therefore, when that happens, it becomes problematic, particularly at that time you had him as the sitting head of state. And you have to be sensitive as someone from outside. You can't dictate to other countries what needs to happen. I think that's where we experienced that failure for him to meet with other political parties, and then he had to go back to South Africa to brief President Ramaphosa. And remember, Dr. Mufamadi is not a head of state, and therefore he can't have the same clout. And with President Ramaphosa going to Mozambique, it was a low key. The statement was issued when he arrived in Mozambique. We kept asking and there was no response. You could see that they didn't want to offend both sides, those who are aggrieved and those who are celebrating. And the question is, did President Ramaphosa find time to whisper to President Nyusi that this matter needs a different approach because it has got an impact on neighboring countries, particularly South Africa?
You're talking about yesterday. You're talking about yesterday, Sophie?
Yes.
But Nyusi is no longer president. So
no,
Nyusi
I'm just saying for starter, because he's still the president of Frelimo. I'm just saying. Two, I saw him with the new president, Chapo. And therefore, did he manage to do that? Now, when I spoke to people in Mozambique, when they unpacked the speech of the incoming president, they told me that it looks like he took some inputs also, or took into consideration what political parties were saying in their manifestos. I saw him saying that those issues that are being raised, like your corruption, unemployment, must be attended to now. So if his speech captured some of issues raised by opposition, it means he is willing to engage. But did President Ramaphosa push that he must do just that? We haven't been privileged to speak to those who accompanied President Ramaphosa just to get behind the scenes what happened and why he was the only leader there. Maybe we might get more information in terms of what are the processes and also what is Chapo saying, because the reality is now the nation is divided and it's not easy to govern.
Before you go there, Sophie, maybe go back a bit. Why hasn't SADC been engaged in the Mozambican problem? Why has it been left to South Africa alone, almost, within SADC to deal with Mozambique?
Prof, you know better that it depends
No, I
who
don't.
is at. No, I'm just saying who depend. It sometimes it's about leadership. Who is at the helm of SADC at that moment when there's a crisis, and the credibility comes in. Now, you know that President Mnangagwa, as the leader of SADC, there was also a pushback that he must take over because of the outstanding matter of the elections in Zimbabwe. And therefore, when you have to also resolve your own problems, sometimes you are reluctant to resolve other people's problems because people will point a finger at you and say, but you have the same problem in your country. So I think because of the issue of credibility of the current chair and the previous elections in that country, it becomes very problematic to pull all SADC member countries together, because you know that SADC is not only liberation organizations now. You have people from the opposition benches who see things differently. The same with Tanzania as the chair of Troika. Much as there isn't much in terms of questioning Sulu Hassan's intervention, but we know behind the scenes that her coming from the Liberation Organization, being a woman, you know, patriarchy is still there. And so there are those issues. That is why many people are pinning their hopes on South Africa. And South Africa, because is the neighbor and a very strategic neighbor. So when you start the negotiations or trying to assist, you come as a neighbor, not necessarily taking over from SADC because of the sensitivities. You know, people always label South Africa as trying to be a big brother. So I'm saying SADC is paralyzed to really be at the forefront in terms of who is at the helm.
But at the same time, Sophie, why, in your view, was Nyusi so resistant to any mediation, whether it was SADC, South Africa in particular, or anybody for that matter? Where was he? What's your understanding?
My understanding, I covered elections in Mozambique, Botswana, Namibia, in fact, South Africa. Now, there's a view that there's a powerful force pushing for regime change in the region, backed by foreign forces. And the so-called powerful business with huge interest and previous powerful influence in the region, serving the interest of a particular minority that once dominated in terms of oppression in the region. So these liberation organizations feel that they are under siege, and therefore there will be a pushback, because for them, what is happening and, you know, the protest, the call for change, it's not based on, yes, there are those issues, but you have also other people with vested interest.
Who are these people? Name them.
It's some NGOs in the region that are operating in the region. That's what these liberation organizations are saying. Because when I did stories on Mozambique, that was very loud to say who is funding. You go to Botswana, they raise the same question: who funded this party or this person? You go to Namibia now, the same question came up, even here in South Africa. So the resistance is based on, it looks like almost we are returning back to colonial past or apartheid, but not necessarily brutal as it was. It's a question of those who benefited during oppression feel that they can wrestle back influence, not power, influence. So there's that view in the region. And I spoke to different people, particularly from the former liberation organization. So much as they've created chaos and mayhem and failed the people in the region, that's how they feel. But the reality is, some of them did lots of bad things, and they have themselves to blame in terms of some running their countries
that's
down.
a fact. But if I may ask a question, do you think that Nyusi or Frelimo, for that matter, believe that Mondlane, Venancio Mondlane, is being sponsored by these groups that the reference you're making?
Yes.
But why would Nyusi and Frelimo be averse to SADC mediation? I'm told the SADC elders yesterday were cold-shouldered during the inauguration yesterday. I can understand them.
Anybody who comes with idea of mediation, it means they will have to make concessions, they will have to share power, and they are pushing back. It might even come from their trusted friends, but it's resistance, it's pushing back. As I pointed out, with Mufamadi's visit to Mozambique, there was a pushback. And you can't question Mufamadi's credibility and background in terms of the Liberation Organization. And he was assigned by the current president. But there was that pushback. So I am not surprised that the elders were isolated.
Yes. Now tell me, Sophie, Cyril was not supposed to be at the inauguration yesterday. And I'm told it was quite a surprise even to those close to him that he turned up as he did. And you have hinted as to the possibility that Cyril found this imperative for him to be there, and that he might have had something to say to both Nyusi and Chapo. Do you have any feedback as to how successful he was in his presence in Maputo yesterday?
No, as I pointed out, I haven't gotten an opportunity to speak to people who can share better information because of the Middle East story. But I am pursuing the story to say what happened in Mozambique, but also what will give an indication is when Chapo is announcing his cabinet, are we going to see people who are not necessarily Frelimo being part of that cabinet, even if it's not political parties or some members of the political parties? So there are indicators that we have to focus on. And that is why I am able to unpack this Mozambique story the way I have done, because you look at movements and links, and of course you speak to people. When you say he was not expected there, I can believe, because normally when the South African president is traveling, we get media advice a day before that the president will tomorrow embark on such a state visit or working visit, or attend his conference or attend the inauguration. So now I even feel more convinced that it wasn't just about being there and making an appearance. Something was happening. And of course, Prof, you've been involved in these things. You know the ANC, you know quiet diplomacy, how they handle these things behind the scenes. You don't need
Yes.
an hour to start a conversation.
Yes. So we must assume, to the extent that Cyril decided at the last minute to go to Mozambique, that indeed the process of reconciliation and possible mediation post-inauguration is in process. Don't you think so, Sophie?
I think so, because the situation the country finds itself in will have an impact on a neighbor, South Africa in particular. You know, South Africa, we support countries in terms of the economic activities. And therefore, we also rely on our neighbors in terms of goods and services. The supply chain will be affected in the region if this matter is not resolved. Because when you continuously block the ports, the export and manufacturing will be affected. So I don't think South Africa can just ignore this thing and just keep quiet. The problem here, he is neither the chair of SADC nor the chair of Organ Troika on politics and defense. But his country is affected. And there are calls that he must find a way to assist, including the opposition in Mozambique.
Yes.
Including the opposition in Mozambique and the NGOs and churches, you know. So,
yeah,
but
to be
there
fair
will be a pushback.
To be fair to South Africa, I mean, the plea for South African mediation, for South African involvement, has come from Mozambicans as a whole, both the opposition and even elements in Frelimo. I mean, you heard Araujo is from Renamo. They have been calling for South Africa. I mean, at a time when it's clear that SADC is not present. If it's just on paper now. I mean, the last problems we've had with elections, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and now Mozambique itself has shown up SADC as a toothless organization, if I may say so. So it is true that South Africa, as a regional hegemon, has a responsibility to get involved as it is. The question is this, Sophie, from what we have heard within the ANC, what kind of what are the expectations from South Africa, from the ANC, as to what the solution should be in Mozambique?
That from the party ANC, clearly it's a question of a liberation organization who takes into consideration this perception of regime change. And therefore, they want to strike a balance not to offend Frelimo, but accepting that this matter must be resolved. Now, it's not clear how they want the matter to be resolved. And I can fully say they would want, there's no way ANC can say Daniel Chapo shouldn't be the president of Mozambique. So that is why the DSG of the ANC keeps saying the country has followed its process in terms of legal process, in terms of that constitutional council. But people on the ground and political parties will then point to the flaws of the constitutional council. So you see, those are the issues that you have to take into consideration. The reality is, and I think now, the focus is on Chapo. How are you going to save your country? Him alone, he can't. If the protests and the demonstrations are sustained, the country is going to collapse. it will be a problem for him,
but Sophie,
not only
Chapo,
for him, including
Sophie,
those who are aggrieved in terms of the outcome of the elections.
no, I agree entirely that we hope that Chapo takes initiative now that he's president. But the elephant in the room is Mondlane. Why is there little or no discussion about how he might be brought in, how he might be reconciled? And I was shocked to hear, and I will ask both yourself and Greg from South Africa, is it true that Mondlane has been in South Africa throughout? And if so, where was he staying? Under whose protection? And with whose assistance has he been churning out social media, including such momentous social media demonstrations across the country? What is your understanding as to what South Africa in particular, but the region generally, thinks as to how Mondlane might be accommodated or pacified or whatever? What's your understanding?
Well, I think South Africa and the ANC would be focusing on political parties and the outgoing government or the new government, not individuals. That is why Sidney Mufamadi perhaps wanted to meet political party leaders. And remember, Mondlane is not a leader of a political party. Now, the other issue is, I don't know whether Mondlane was here in the country, but I can tell you there's no way the South African media wouldn't have gotten Mondlane. We knew when he came. Unfortunately, a day or two we're told he has left. He's now in Portugal. No, in Sweden, in fact. And then later we heard he was in Portugal, he was in France, those movements, but he was in Europe. As far as we know, he was in Europe. But
Yes.
I think the first speaker can share better information, because if he was in Europe, when he went back, there's no way he could have used SAA or a link coming from Europe. I think there are direct flights to Maputo. You can work out the movements.
Okay,
But
let's
the
get back
reality
to
is the
let's get back to
support
Mondlane.
system.
Let's get to the Mondlane factor. Let's get back to the Mondlane factor. Yes, he doesn't belong to a party. He seems to have a checkered history in terms of his party affiliations over the years. But you will agree, is the elephant in the room, isn't he?
Yes,
Are we
yes,
going to just
because
ignore him?
no, you
What's
can't
your view?
ignore him. You
Yes.
can't ignore him. You can't ignore him. But what I'm saying is, he was not around. Even those meetings that were called, even the arrival of Mufamadi in Mozambique, he was not in the country. But you can't ignore him. Now he is back.
What's your
Now,
view? How shall we deal with him? What's your recommendation, Sophie, as an opinion maker in the region? What should be done about Mondlane?
all
Mondlane has
stakeholders.
threatened to run a parallel government almost. He has threatened to do that. Is that sustainable?
It's not sustainable.
Isn't that a
It's not
recipe for a
sustainable.
civil war potentially in Mozambique? Yeah? No?
Yes, it's a recipe for civil war. It's not sustainable. Now, the question is, when you talk about civil war, it gets even more dangerous. As a leader, do you want to see people dying? So
Yes.
that is why I'm saying you need sober minds on these issues. And you have to move very careful, looking at all the dynamics. You can't leave others behind and
Yes.
you are not able to resolve the problem. You can't do that. Now,
I've been interrogating you
maybe
too much.
the first
You want
speaker,
to say something, make a statement of your own now, but I've been worrying you, interrogating you. I've been playing your role against you. You say what you want to say, what you wanted to say at the outset. No, please.
what, Prof?
What do you want to say in this conversation as to the way forward for us in Mozambique?
negotiations is the only solution. And as I pointed out, because I talk to people from Mozambique, I want us to use Chapo's speech. What does it communicate? And be optimistic that that speech communicate a message of someone who wants to reach out.
Yes.
How people respond, it will be the Mozambicans themselves who must decide on a way forward in terms of their country. So that is why I'm saying we still have to investigate what's happening, what's being said, and what is Chapo up to. But the reality is, at the end of the day, the Mozambicans themselves must be supported in finding a solution to these challenges that they are facing. But I would perhaps, it's a pity, I don't know whether he's back, the first speaker to tell us on the issue of whether Chapo was in South Africa. But the reality is he's got a very sophisticated machinery, and you can only have that if you have resources. The question is,
yes.
where does he get the resources?
Yes, we'll come to that. Do you have any idea as to where he gets the resources before I turn on to the next speaker?
No, I don't. But you have these allegations that there are NGOs, some of them are based in South Africa, that are supporting him. As I pointed out, there's this notion that the regime change is based on a very powerful movement, subtle current, not to take over power, but to assert ourselves again as influential people in the region, because we know when we are influential, what do we tend to benefit, even though we are not seen or we are not in a forefront.
Yeah, we'll come back to you. You're talking tongue in cheek, but we got the message. I'll come back to you, Sophie. Thanks very much indeed for really helping us in this discussion. I now turn to Greg Mills. Greg, there's been more than just a hint at the NGOs, and one of the NGOs that people have been talking about is, of course, yours and the Brenters Foundation. What is it that how true are the allegations that Brenters Foundation has been one of the organizations actually supporting, if not propping up, Mondlane over the last 3 months? Can we start there, Greg?
Well, that's absolute poppycock. And it's part of a tendency to try and externalize all your failings and inadequacies. So as soon as there's a problem, you say, oh, it's somebody else. It's the CIA. It's the KGB. It's the global Illuminati. You're one step away from inventing windmills to tilt at and making your mistakes in a sense, the responsibility of others. And I think fundamentally, that's what I would say about Mozambique, which is all of this is happening, and this has happened because of dire developmental performance over the last 50 years. Now, the first, let's say, 25 years of that, you could possibly excuse, or even the first 20 years of that, you could possibly excuse up until the mid-1990s when the country settled back down again after its period of liberation and then of civil war. But the performance since 1995 has also been massively dire. And there's no hint that a new Frelimo administration is going to have any better grip on governance and on actually managing the country than its predecessors have had. And I think here it's very important to point out a number of basic statistics. The first of these is that Mozambique's population has gone from 15 million people in the mid-1990s, so 30 years ago, to 35 million people today. You've more than doubled the population over the last generation. And that, of course, is going to rapidly increase, even if population birth rates come down, because you've got so many more young people in your cities in particular, but in your society more generally. This is a country where the adult literacy rate is just about half, and the national poverty rate is just under 2/3 of the population. So staggeringly high. Even before COVID, it was at 63% of the population. 42% of people in Mozambique, and 42% of children, and 30% of deaths, so nearly 1/3 of all deaths, are from malaria, which is a preventable disease and which is very closely linked to poor conditions of governance and poor conditions overall in which people are living. And for all of the hubris, frankly, about Mozambique as an investment destination, about massive oil and gas finds, all of which is true, but these are finds which are going to benefit an elite, of course, much more than they're going to benefit a people. For all of that hubris, this is a country that on the United Nations Human Development Index, I'm not talking about, a business competitiveness index, I'm talking about the UN's Human Development Index, ranks at 185 out of 191 countries. And if you look at competitiveness, it's basically at the bottom of the 140 countries. I think it's 137th of the 140 countries that are assessed in terms of the World Competitiveness Report. So this is a system which is done very badly. Forget about global standards. It's done very badly by its own people. And the majority of its own people, and this is the point I make about demography, are now young. And they connected with these things, cell phones, and they're unhappy and they're cross. And so there's no evidence whatsoever. And I want to talk about the things we know as opposed to the things we think we know, like, there's external agents trying to undo Mozambique. In fact, Frelimo is doing a fantastic job at undoing itself. It doesn't need the help of anybody from outside to do it. This is done by Frelimo. And that's the first thing we definitely know. The second thing we definitely know is that the election was dodgy. Why do we know that it's dodgy? Well, for the simple reason that when it takes a very, very long time, or if it takes a rather unerringly short time to get election results out, generally the rig is in. So in this case, the election results came out very, very quickly. And then you had this extraordinary spectacle of this dragged out process by the Constitutional Council, which is not supposed to declare on election results, save to say whether they're free or fair or not. Then coming up with a kind of alternative offer, which is, no, you didn't get that many seats, we're going to up your bid to 25%, which was the case of Podemos. So, and MDN doubled its number of seats and so on. And that smells. In political terms, it smells. So there's definitely something going on which is cooked. The third thing we definitely know is that the region has a predilection to close ranks with incumbents. We know this. We know this from Zimbabwe. We know this from Angola. We know this from Namibia. And we know this, of course, from Mozambique in this instance. And the ANC was so quick, almost lightning fast. If only it was lightning fast at doing stuff in South Africa in the same way, it was lightning fast in declaring Frelimo as the winner and sending congratulations to them. So we know that they're going to close ranks. And the other respect in the way in which they close ranks is that there's a double standard at play here. So no one supports violence. Of course, no one supports violence. But you can't just be critical of violence which is perpetrated by the opposition, which is often a sense of powerlessness, but because there's very little option left open to them, and then not be critical of the violence that's perpetrated by the regime, which of course has a foreign army actually operating on its behalf in the north of the country. And I don't think, and that's the further indication of where this is going, I don't think there's any better illustration of weak and failing governance than relying on foreigners to keep the peace in your own country. The reasons for that violence in the first instance, in the case of the insurrection in the north, and then the inability to actually get a grip on that violence, I think speaks volumes about what Frelimo is and what Mozambique has become. The fourth thing I think we know for certain is that Frelimo believes it owns the country. To use Lutero Simango's words, liberation movements think they own it. It belongs to them. They can more or less act with impunity. But the fifth aspect I would point out is that impunity is an exportable good. So when impunity happens in one place, it exports that message outside of the region. And of course, just like state capture didn't start in South Africa, I think Zimbabweans got a much better grip on state capture earlier on than we did. We just maybe perfected it at a different level. State impunity has also, of course, not just started in Mozambique, but it's reinforced the sense of impunity, not accountability. And that's the cost of what's happening in Mozambique. The cost of what's happening in Mozambique is to be felt in terms of what this means for the entire region, what it means in terms of its investability, what it means in terms of its political stability and security overall for its citizens. So essentially it's Frelimo, as in other liberation movements, holding the country and the region by implication hostage to their grip on power and the goodies that go with it. And that's the other thing I would say about this, is we underestimate, I think, the political economy of national liberation movements at our peril. Because as you know well in Zimbabwe, and we have learned in South Africa.
Greg, you and I have had this conversation before. I share the view that the former liberation movements have long served their purpose, But I think, don't you think you are over exaggerating their presence now? Whether it's Mozambique.
Sorry, you broke up there, Ibo.
Don't you think we are exaggerating the currency of liberation movements, former liberation movements? And these just names: Frelimo, ZANU, ANC, SWAPO. These are just slogans. In terms of content, there is little or nothing that represents their former selves. Let's be very honest about that. So I think we need to look at the nature of the states that we have. I mean, thank you very much for the outline of Mozambique. But one of the things that clearly makes Mozambique stand out is the extent to which it's just a territory. Ever since the Portuguese carved it out in the 15th century, it's a territory as opposed to a nation. When we did a study of Mozambique, 2000, the SAPES UNDP Human Development Report, we were shocked to see that 90% of the GDP of Mozambique is Maputo alone. And Maputo, formerly Lorenzo Marx, was an enclave of South Africa, as Beira was of Rhodesia. So you have a country which is really, in terms of content, economic and political, really has been very amorphous, really. And therefore, if we accept that, instead of highlighting the failures of Frelimo, don't we want to re-examine the political economy of Mozambique in itself? The nature of the state, the capacity of the state, if any, and most of all, what is it that can be done to make the state stronger, capable, capacity? We have seen all this investment from oil, gas, what have you. There's little or no trickle down to the population in Mozambique. None. Glossy buildings in Maputo, But in terms of the content of life for the people of Mozambique, no. What can be done? What is the position? I mean, you quickly brushed off the criticism and allegations that Prentice Foundation are busy in the region, but you clearly have done a number of studies in the region. We launched one book at SAPES. What does the Prentice Foundation have as a possible scenario, positive scenario for Mozambique in the months and years ahead?
Yeah, okay. Well, there's many things you've raised there, Ibo. But let me try and both complete what I was setting out to do and also simultaneously answer your questions. I wouldn't underestimate the power of the liberation movements, particularly as a perpetuation of elite political economy or elite-driven political economies in the sub-region. They operate, and I would dispute your view that they are the state needs to be strengthened as a mechanism of delivery. What we've seen is yes, an immensely weak state, but a state that suits the interests of that elite. It's not that the state is inefficient at delivering to the elite. It's very efficient. It's in fact lightning fast at delivering against elite interests. It's extremely able when it comes to obfuscating and making obtuse systems and issues of accountability. It's an extraordinary creature of efficiency, but not in terms of its central purpose, as you and I believe would share, which is delivery to the majority of its citizens. So I just think the state is wrongly geared. It's predicated on maintaining a series of elite interests rather than delivering to people. And the record in Mozambique shows this very clearly. Look at those poverty stats. It's extraordinary that the number of people living in poverty in a country with so many resources and as rich as Mozambique has perpetuated for 50 years after independence, because that's where we are 50 years later. But let me just conclude by saying two things. One is, I don't believe salvation is going to come from outside. I don't believe salvation is going to come from outside in terms of whether the ANC or anybody else, ZANU-PF, congratulates Frelimo. It's not going to help Frelimo. Ultimately, it's going to help them keep their grip on power in the short term, but it's not going to help them in their aim of delivery. Or despite what Chapo said in his inauguration speech yesterday, in all terms of all the good things about a slimmer, smaller government. Certainly, redemption is not going to come from outside for the majority of Mozambicans who want to see change. Where that's going to come about is in the internal forces within Mozambique getting better organized. I think that Modlane is an immensely brave individual, and I don't think one should simply poo-poo that. I think he's been enormously courageous in terms of what he's done, and certainly going back to the country was an enormously courageous undertaking in the circumstances where he returned. But I think they have a very big job on their hands. They have a very big job on their hands because, one, the region's closed ranks. Two, the international community is pretty much disinterested in the story of human rights. Interests have trumped human rights, and they want to just simply see the problem go away, and they're not going to say anything that's going to make the problem perpetuate. So they're trying to dampen it down as much as possible. And you hear continuously mutterings amongst diplomats, Podemos is worse than Frelimo. We don't know what their agenda is, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll return to that just briefly in a second. So redemption is not going to come from outside. It's going to have to come from internally. And there are many divisions in the opposition, not least within Podemos very clearly itself. As there's what I would call the VX factor, is that people get bought off very quickly. International trips, business class travel, and a VX into the bargain, and suddenly, you're part of the government cabal. you're on the government feeding scheme. So they're going to have to bring about a degree of unity, which has hitherto been lacking. They're going to have to set very clear goals and have some sort of methodology in that long haul by which they're going to achieve them. And they're going to have to manage the narrative very carefully, because the narrative is skewed. And we've already heard this on this seminar. The narrative is skewed towards casting the opposition as the bad guys, as the ones who are using violence, as the ones who somehow need to be mediated into this government of national unity project or process. And they're going to have a narrative that kind of puts them apart from that, elevates their position. And let me just end with a point about negotiations. We heard the previous speaker, Sophie, said negotiations is the only solution. Now, if I look at Zimbabwe, it's not a fantastic solution. In fact, negotiations, which was not the mandate given by the Zimbabwean people back in 2008 at all, it wasn't what they were voting for, by the way, actually turned out to be a pretty terrible solution. It's also not in the power of the international community, whether it's in SADC or, frankly, in Iceland. It's not their right to decide on negotiations. That's the right of the Mozambican people, and we shouldn't forget that when we focus on trying to devise an externally directed outcome for Mozambique. It's what the Mozambicans want. And the opposition, and I think led by Motlana and Letera Simango and Manuel and others, is going to have to devise a program and a plan which clearly identifies what they want and how they're going to go about getting it in negotiations with the government. And the outside world has to be very careful about presuming a solution, a negotiated, mediated, disintermediated solution that has some form of unity government, because maybe that's not what, and I'm not presuming this, but maybe that's not what the Mozambicans want or require. So we should be very careful about that.
I hear you, Greg, but the history of the region is all about mediated settlements. Whether it was Zimbabwe at Lancaster, South Africa at Odessa. So why should Mozambique be different? It's particularly since, from what Araujo just told us, there appears to be no capacity, internal capacity, to bring people together. I mean,
well, Ibo, you must be very careful not to confuse two different types of things here.
Yeah. What do you mean?
There's sorry, you broke up there. I thought you had finished. There's a political solution which leads to an election. That's Cadessa, that's Lancaster House, that's the settlement process. There's an election which is disputed, which then has some sort of, negotiation process. Everyone gets together and they arrive at some sort of unity government. That's Zimbabwe circa 2008, 2009, where it's a dispute. No, because South Africa wasn't disputed. The election results were not disputed on the 29th of May last year. It was a negotiation because there was no majority.
But there was a stalemate, okay? And a stalemate between forces, different forces, which had to be mediated in the form that you have to use your term, all-inclusive government. I mean, this is not an accident. It is something that has been formulated and designed, so to speak, by the various forces behind the scenes. Isn't it possible too?
No, but you didn't have.
We have similar forces in Mozambique mediating, playing a role. I mean, let me get to the point. The elephant in the room, Mondlane. What do you see as his role in Mozambique in the months and years ahead? Are we going to just ignore him or find some way of accommodating him? And if that is not some kind of mediation, what is?
Well, he's already. I mean, this is what I said. I think that the opposition has a very tough period of soul searching ahead of it, because the forces internationally, and I include the region in that international ambit, are more or less arrayed against it. They're not giving them any space in which to operate. There's very little wiggle room for them. So they're going to have to work out for themselves a plan whereby they maintain a degree of political pressure. Their position before this was they wanted new elections. That was their bottom line in this process. And then in addition to that, they wanted a series of reforms and everything else that will flow from that. That now seems to be very far away. So what's their next fallback option? I think the world is looking and waiting and watching to see what he does.
Yeah, let's hear from Agostino Zacharias, who has been involved in somehow together with Araujo, and I'll be coming back to Araujo shortly. But let's get down to Agostino. What's the nature of the process at the moment in terms of negotiations, in terms of the dialogue between the various parties and forces involved in the Mozambique situation, the Mozambique crisis, if you can call it that? Agostino? Agostino?
He's still not in the platform.
He's still not?
Yes, he's not on the platform.
Oh, muito mal. Araujo, can you come back, please?
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. My question to Agostino refers, what is the nature of the, well, let me put it differently. What do you think is the way forward now? What is your proposal as to the way forward? We have this elephant in the room, which I've mentioned with reference to Mondlane. Greg made the point very poignantly that whatever happens in Mozambique, it depends on the Mozambicans themselves more than the external, even though it is obvious the external must assist where they can, but it is true that everything depends very much on yourselves as Mozambicans. What are the indicators of a possible solution post-inauguration?
Well, thank you very, very much. Allow me, first of all, to say that I was very happy on the way Greg formulated the current situation in Mozambique by bringing in numbers and by exposing, literally saying what I have been always saying, that Mozambique is very close, if it's not a perfect example of a failed state. I mean, in all, it is not delivering. So the nature, indeed, as Ibo said, to be re-examined about its capacity, about its objectives, and to whom it's serving. Of course, it was said in this panel that it serves a very little minority, which is most of it concentrated in Maputo, because that's where the money is, and while the other provinces work as a kind of a reservoir for labor and for natural resources. But all the outcomes, all the revenues goes to Maputo, including taxes and so on. So, I mean, that characterization in terms, of course, and we work together, Ibo, on the Mozambican Human Development Reports with the Gumende and others. Of course, we found out that, like those numbers were staggering at that time, like 20 years ago, when we came up with the first Mozambican, but also with the first SADC Human Development Report. On the other side, what Sophie said, that there is this conception. Actually, I heard from some good sources in the ANC that the ANC is organizing a SADC movement of the liberation movement to reorganize themselves so that they can cover their ground. So, like, these two perceptions are there, and we need to take in account. So, what to do? What can be done? I think that was your question. Well, the perfect solution would have been for the Constitutional Court to nullify the results, given the almost consensus about the non-free, fair, and so on of the election, about the fraud. I mean, we had enough evidence to prove, and people external and extent. So these elections definitely were not free, were not just, and were not fair. So in that case, and actually, even the Constitutional Court recognized it, but it falls short of nullifying that. I think that would have been the best tool too. But of course, it's not in the interest of Frelimo, and it's Frelimo who appoints the judges who determine. Actually, Mozambique is in a very interesting situation where the Constitutional Court and the National Commission, Electoral Commission, are not bodies as it happens in other countries. They don't only count the votes, they decide which votes to count and whom to give those votes. This is a very crucial and a very interesting legislation, for legal framework, where the Constitutional Court, they decide who to give. No, they don't just count. That we missed that objective of nullifying the election after. I mean, in the Mozambican legal framework, if the Constitutional Court validates the elections, then there is no other legal way of, I mean, like, you cannot do anything else after they validate. So during that period and the inauguration, the idea, and there was also a very good consensus, both from civil society, but also from the political parties, that a settlement could be reached. And the discussion was whether this settlement will be internally organized, that it will be enough room for internal, or if we needed a foreign help to reach this settlement. Even influential people within Frelimo, they were of the ground that we needed a kind of a settlement, internal settlement. But what happened was that actually Frelimo engaged in these so-called internal negotiation. But when the possibility of internal engagement came and South Africa offered to help and to mediate and other institutions too, the hardliners within Frelimo, they refused the South African support, and they called in the political parties in what they call internal dialogue. So this internal dialogue produced a document, which in Portuguese is called Proposta de Pacto Social para Mozambique. I mean, in English, it will be a proposal for a social pact for Mozambique. So there is actually a document which was produced by political parties, namely Renamo, MDM of Lutero, and one non-parliamentary party, which is called Nova Democracia. They worked over 3 to 4, around 10 days. They came up with that proposal. And basically, that proposal was saying that in this process, they should be recognized as parties of this pact, basically. They put some clauses, which, if you just give me 1 second, there are around 6 clauses. Or the first, it defines the objects. 1, to reform the state. 2nd, to reform the judiciary. 3rd, to reform the electoral system. 4th, to redefine defense and security. And these, I think, may have to do with the issue of Rwanda and so on. Or 5th, the issue of the need to modernize public administration. The 6th, the issue of natural resources. 7th, the issue of reconciliation and national unity, including, and they here mention, the need for an inclusion government, a government which will be constituted of all political parties. And lastly, it says there was a need for an economic inclusion. This was like the framework which this week was produced, and it was given to President Nyusi. And at the end, it says, I mean, it puts Nyusi as a signatory of this pact, and then Chapo is the Secretary General of Frelimo, and then Osuf Momad from Renamo, Lutero Simango from MDM, Podemos with Albino Forquilla, President of Salomão Mucha. The idea was that this document would have been signed before Chapo takes oath, is sworn in. But Frelimo took the document, Well, we don't know because this document was supposed also to be discussed in other forums. So far, it has been kept somehow secret. And since the document was given to President Nyusi and Chapo for them to react and to be, if it will be signed, we never heard out of it. So it was not signed, as far as I know. And therefore, given that it was, Frelimo used this conversation to undermine possible foreign intervention, namely the South Africa, by saying we don't need foreign mediation here because we are already in an internal process. So they managed to do both. And now that Chapo is, was sworn in, and they managed to silence the opposition during this period, it also achieved another objective, which was to isolate Venancio Mondlane because Venancio was not part of it. So they divided the opposition. Now they can reign. I mean, this is my view, unless, or unlike, if I'm mistaken, because now the priority of Chapo is to deliver. He's in charge. I don't think he will have much time. I hope I'm wrong, and I'm praying to be wrong. I hope that now it's in the hands of him. So he will calibrate which speed to give, which points on this document you could advance, and which one to forget. So the likelihood of an internal settlement, I think, is challenging. And as Greg said, the opposition needs to re-energize and to reorganize and come up with an alternative plan. One will be to continue with the demonstrations, but the biggest and the contentious issues in Mozambique is, should these demonstrations be peaceful as the ones we waged in Kelimane for 71 days, which were very peaceful and so on, or for Frelimo to listen, these demonstrations should be violent, as in Maputo, by closing borders, closing the ports and so on, so that our neighbors can feel our pain. Because as I speak, 2 minutes ago, I got another WhatsApp message, with young people who were shot and so on. So people are being killed in several places. The police is being very brutal. So if Chapo wanted really to maintain this dialogue, his first measure should be, in my view, to replace the national commander of the police and send a message that this is a democratic state and that the law should be followed. And then,
okay.
I think the scene will be set up
on that point, Manuel, on that point, and the people are asking on WhatsApp and on chats, they're asking the following question. Maybe it's a question I'm putting to the three of you. Manuel first, and then Greg, and then Sophie. Do you think, and Sophie did hint at it already, whether Chapo might just produce a cabinet that reflects some kind of unity or some kind of reconciliation among the Frelimo and the other parties? You made reference, Manuel, to a document. Is it too late to put that on the table? Or
no, it is not too late. It is not too late.
Do you think Chapo is alive to it? Would Chapo? There's an argument. You know better than I do. There's an argument when I was in Mozambique during the elections, and also a year ago, or 18 months ago, when I went for the Samora Machel's 90th birthday, that Chapo was not Nyusi's favorite. That Chapo may have come in spite of Nyusi. And that Chapo, now that he's a president, inaugurated as he has been, that he might have his own plan about the future of I heard from one of you, I think it was you, that he used some of the elements from the various manifestos, including Mondlane's manifesto, to include in his speech yesterday. the question is, do you think Chapo is alive to the need for some kind of unity? Or do you think that kind of unity, that kind of settlement, political settlement, is someone that must be assisted, mediated from outside, South Africa, for example? Do you think?
Well, the biggest challenge Chapo is facing is for himself to assert to be on the driving seat. Why? Because Frelimo, as we speak, has got 5 factions. You have the Nyusi faction, you have the Chipande faction, who is an older liberation veteran, actually the guy who fired the first bullet. So symbolically, he's the father of all the Makondes and the Makonde faction. Then you have the Gebuza faction, then you have the Chisano faction, and you have the Grasa Machel faction. So this normally, when a president is elected, these factions bring their own proposal for ministers. Like Grasa will get 2 ministries, or Chisano will get 3 or 4. So it's like an oligopoly, you know. Then they share, they discuss. So Chapo was elected. Apparently, it did not belong to none of these. But this is a positive sign, but also his biggest weakness, because he cannot by himself push for it. Will he be able of bringing in a kind of a coalition or an inclusive government? That's a very big question. I mean, he may try, but all of these people will need, in that government, they will need to have their own representatives. As you can see, there are already 5 factions now, plus the Chapo's factions, so 6. So if each of them appoints 2, then you have already 12 ministries. But Chapo said he wanted a small government. Is he going to accommodate all these appetites for power? They are not
we'll see.
only
We'll
appointing these people for this position.
We'll see shortly.
Yes, the reason is...
Let's let Greg come in quickly before he goes. Greg, my question refers.
Yeah, Ebo, it's a great question as ever. You're always putting us on the spot. I think there's a question here as what Chapo should do. So what could he do? What's within his power? And Manuel knows the factional makeup clearly very well of Mozambican politics. Does he attempt to kind of defuse this by appointing a semi-inclusive, at least in his own mind, cabinet, or does he engage in a national dialogue first? Now, if he does the cabinet option, let's call it the VX option, because it's a shorthand for inclusion by patronage. That offers some short-term possibilities, but it doesn't change the governance structure and challenge facing Mozambique. So you're going to see, in a sense, a perpetuation of the status quo rather than the sort of change that the country requires. And he may indeed, out of that, see increased violence as a reaction because people feel that they're not being consulted and being excluded. So if there is a role to be played by the outside world, it is to put pressure evenly, and I use the word evenly with some emphasis, on parties to engage in dialogue first, rather than try and do the gesture thing and attempt the VX option, which is not going to lead them anywhere at all. So can Chapo be big, not a big man, but big in his political outlook and change the direction of Mozambique rather than simply reinforce the model that we've seen, which has delivered Mozambique to this point? That's a big question. And that's what the region should be thinking about. How do we pressure evenly all sides to talk about this?
And I'm glad you still see the possibility of the region or someone in the region facilitating this kind of process. Okay, thanks, Greg. Before I turn, Agostino, are you there now? Agostino?
Yes, I've been here, and
Yeah.
for some reason, I think I couldn't be connected. I don't know
Yeah, I'm so
why.
sorry.
I think I'm a
So,
BBC, born before
yeah,
computers. Maybe this is
you,
my problem.
you like me. You should have someone to help you with the technology. Anyway, Karibu, as they say in Swahili.
Asante sana.
You have heard everybody talk. What are your conclusions? What are your recommendations as we
I
close?
missed Arawuja for the second time. I I missed Arawuja for the second term, but if I may, just a couple of points. I think I tend to agree, or I agree fully with those who believe that negotiations or dialogue is the only way forward. But there's still no consensus about this dialogue at different levels. First of all, the nature of
Agostino, you're breaking. Agostino, you're breaking. Agostino, Agostino.
hello
Yeah, you had broke. You had gone mute. Repeat what you were saying.
tone. I don't think that there is a common understanding of what these negotiations should be about and what format and whether or not should be mediated or supported by external forces or external mediator or facilitator. I
Okay.
heard voices coming from ruling party saying dialogue is not negotiations. I have heard voices that, some of these issues or the issues that have been pointed out, and Inyusi was very emphatic in his speech yesterday that let Mozambicans solve their problem without any foreign pressures. I think he was reiterating the fact that he is not favoring negotiations which are supported by external forces. And I have heard also that, some of the things or most of the things that have been highlighted either by Venancio and the other political parties are issues to be solved by the parliament. So if you shift that dialogue from where it is supposed to be between the parties and also involving the civil society and the public at large to parliament, it just seems that nothing this dialogue will be resolving, will be addressing. So if the external forces or the friends of Mozambique want to help, is in highlighting and advising all those concerns, the ways in which this dialogue can succeed and can change the situation in Mozambique. Second, there are several issues that cannot be dealt with only within the realm of political parties. You would need to have expertise in dealing with them. You would need to have the public at large, other societies, other civil society organizations to get involved. It is not clear at what stage and the form in which they will be able or helped to participate. There is a document like Arauja has highlighted, which was prepared by the opposition political parties, which raised many issues, including some of the issues, for those of you who are aware, when President News called a meeting to start dialoguing with the opposition. He, Venancio, and then he wrote a letter to Venancio. Venancio responded by saying, "What is the agenda? And because you have not given me an agenda, I'll give you an agenda of what I would like we to talk about." So, and then he sent this agenda. I'm informed that some of the issues that Venancio raised are in this document to be considered. And I'm also informed that the political parties, this has to the issue of the elephant in the room, as some of you call it, Venancio. The political parties yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, they had a meeting with Venancio, or the day before, and in order to see the ways of including him to participate. And I'm informed by some of the political parties who participated in these consultations that they were happy with the outcome of the meeting, in which they managed to convince Venancio that he should be joining the dialogue. However, I'm cautioning that it's still very unclear as to the nature of the dialogue, whether it's going to be a really fully inclusive and an honest and frank dialogue, which will help in solving some of the Mozambican of the problems that Mozambique is facing currently, and being them security issues, being them political, the transformations of institutions and transformation of the legislation, the electoral legislation, and including alterations that might be required to the constitution, because some of the political parties and individuals have said that the reason why we're having this problem is because there are loopholes in the legislations and in the working of institutions and also in the constitution that allow fraud and rigging. That if that is done, and the way the elections are conducted, the electoral process in Mozambique, if we were to introduce some reforms and also some measures that can impede those ones in charge of elections to behave in a certain way, that would be a great help, because there are those who are fearing that now that the process has been concluded with all the legal solution put forward that allowed the ruling party to send MPs to parliament and also award victory to the current president of Mozambique, Daniel Chapo. These institutions are not to be trusted. And actually, they use methodology to award this victory that is not legal at all. So I think there are so many questions that one need to revisit in order to come back with a solution which pacifies most of the people who are in the street, and which also pacify many concerns among Mozambicans, the followers of political parties, as well as normal citizens that don't have any political parties, but they have equally concerns about the electoral process in Mozambique, and about the governance, and about the way the economy and the things are run in the country. Because before we got here where we are at the moment, there have been lots of warnings that we are sitting in a time bomb that is supposed to be exploding anytime. And those warnings, I don't think that anybody acted upon. The authorities, maybe they didn't take them very seriously. And it happens so that we are at this stage because of the things that we're enabled to do. And there's no guarantee that this is the time if we don't have proper arrangements in place, if we don't have the proper structure, and if we don't have a methodology to debate all these issues that will lead to a certain conclusions, because in the lack of that, we will only be forced to adopt some cosmetic measures short term, which people believe that, oh, we have solved the problem, which in 5 years' time is going to be there again.
A direct question, Agostino. Do you think that Chapo might just pull it off, develop an all-inclusive government? Or do you think he's going to play what I think Nyusi has been trying to play, which is the Zimbabwe card of controlling the opposition? I sent you a little card just now on your phone, a quotation from Lenin, which says, the best way to control the opposition is to lead it ourselves.
Yes.
And this is a Zimbabwe model at the moment, where the opposition has been compromised, and virtually you have an opposition who is no longer an opposition. I had a feeling that one stage that Nyusi was trying to copy Zimbabwe, copy Mnangagwa, try and have the opposition compromise. But do you think Chapo, notwithstanding what Manuel said just now, about the factionalism in Frelimo, do you think Chapo might just develop the capacity and the courage to break out from the Frelimo mold and create some kind of an all-inclusive government? Do you think it's possible?
It remains to be seen. So far, I think all we have is a wonderful speech. Whether he's got a force to influence his colleagues in the party and to drive the reforms the way he said he will, I think only time will tell. But I caution that here, if you want to, I think Frelimo has done this before, that I remember the time that the new constitution, the one that advocates for, I mean, the multi-party constitution was adopted. Renamo did not have a role at all. And then it was questioned whether that is a constitution that it's representative of Mozambique or it's a Frelimo constitution. So I think the question will be raised again if you move too fast, introducing reforms without the participation of all those concerned and not hearing also the public in general. So whether he does have a force to reform the system, because he's not acting upon, he's not acting alone. He has to go through party structures. Nyusi continues to be the president of Frelimo. The next central committee meeting is in February. He is not out until February. I think there will try to be a push for him to leave the party presidency in February. But it depends whether Chapo, for instance, will have a secretariat within the party that allow him to do things, or it's a secretariat that will try to protect some of the interest gained in the past years. I think this is a very, how can I say, a difficult thing to assure you that he will he can, because there's quite a lot of negotiations to take place, not only with the party, within the various factions of the party, as Arouj pointed out, but also whether there is a general willingness. And I think from the beginning, from some point, there has been there has not been a large appetite of including Venancio in the solutions. I think there's still some people who believe that, Venancio has reached the end of the road. Is not able to cause any damage anymore. So we just ignore him and deal with the rest of the opposition. And then the situation will normalize itself. But there are those who believe that, no, I think the immediate thing to do is really trying to convert or talk to Venancio and to see whether he can play a positive role in the society. And that would be the way to bring lasting solutions into the country. I'm not sure.
And that's your recommendation, Agostino?
That would be my recommendation, that, we've gone through so much in the past. I don't think that the past conflict has been fully resolved. And there were some leftovers because maybe we did not consider, we as the Mozambicans, all the aspects, and including the people who did not have a particular interest of the political parties into this debate. The negotiations in Rome, the negotiations and the peace process that followed in Mozambique, it was only among the political parties. The other actors were not brought in to take this conflict or the problems outside the realm of the political parties and to be shared by everybody. I mean, there is a say that you and I are familiar that war is a very serious matter to be left to the generals, and so is politics, and so is the political life of a society cannot only be left to the political parties aside. I think there's that one.
No, I hear you. You came in late, but you listened to the entire conversation, and your submission has been very useful, not least your last recommendation, I think, which we take note of. So thanks very much, Agostino. I'll now move to Greg. If you're still there, your last word, Greg. If probably you're leaving by 7:30. If you're gone, then I'll call Sophie. Sophie, your last word.
Yes, Prof. I think all the people who participated here, I've learned a lot as a journalist in terms of taking the story forward. And just on a parting shot, Nomvula was on SABC just now. The ANC is saying Mozambicans must engage in a dialogue, in an inclusive dialogue. So you can already see that, or my analysis is correct, that Ramaphosa might have gone there to go and whisper into their ears, and it means Nomvula was with the president the whole day, and she's part of the top 7. What Nomvula says in public, particularly on international relations, would have been approved by President
Nomvula who?
Mokonyane, the deputy, the first deputy secretary general. Remember, she's the chair.
Okay. And this was this evening on
international.
This was this evening on SABC.
So yeah, while we were busy at 6.
Okay.
Because I invited her to come and talk about Middle East because of the ANC's campaign on issues of Middle East.
Okay.
So
that's very encouraging.
It's getting there.
Very
Yeah,
encouraging.
I'll get that, Kana King. I'll get that interview later and I'll send the link. So
Thanks
I
a lot.
think that's basically it. I think for me, let's watch Cabinet.
Okay.
And I'm happy I got lots of information from the panel members, and I will do follow-up in terms of stories around that document that I don't have. I wish I can have it. And then also the meeting yesterday of the opposition parties. So thank you so much. But at the end of the day, it is important for the leaders on the continent to understand that they brought these problems to themselves by not delivering. Two, the opposition also is found wanting. When they get in there, they do things differently. Look what's happening in Kenya. Look what's happening in Malawi. You know, so that's why I don't know what to say, because even the opposition, when they are now in power and having absolute power, they tend to disappoint. They don't serve the people. And you have a youngest population on the continent that is very restless. But it looks like us, the oldies, we don't care. So that's my parting shot. So let's see in terms of where to from here.
Thanks, Sophie. You've been great. You've been great. Thank you very much for gracing this platform. I'm sure we can take it further through you and your esteemed colleagues at SABC. As usual, Chef, my former student, now my chef. Please.
No.
Now, your last
Obrigado, Professor. So, first of all, I want to say that it's very important for all of us to recognize that this is a governance issue. It's not only about elections. There is something deeper. People just use elections as the tool to raise so many problems that they are facing, be it lack of accountability, be it lack of opportunities, be it lack of housing policies, employment, and so on. So the magnitude of failure to deliver and the nature of the way the post-colonial state has responded to the expectations is very short of what the youth were expecting. So this is not only a problem for Mozambique, it's a problem of all the continent, Africa. And as we all know, Africa is the fastest urbanized continent. And one of the characteristics of this urbanization process is its youthness. So the youth will be demanding more and more and more. So we need really to find a way to respond to those issues. Second, I think that the role of internal actors cannot be we'll do our homework. But I want also to say that as for the independence of most countries, the role of foreign or regional actors should not be underestimated either. I think that SADC, if we want to be and remain important in the region, but not sidelined, needs to reform itself and start engaging. And the organ, because we saw really, if allow me to use this word, which is very undiplomatic, I felt that the Troika did not live up to the standards and to the expectations of the region, because the Troika should have been more assertive, first of all, not only to manage or to resolve conflict, but its role is also, it needed to be equipped of preventing the rise of conflict at this level in the region. Otherwise, I think that it will become irrelevant in the short run, both the Troika, but also SADC. And I hope that heads of states, there is one topic that we did not discuss today, and I hope we can discuss it at another forum, was I think these only 2 heads of state attended this inauguration. It's a signal of something. Only Cyril Ramaphosa, and it was said at last minute, and the quasi-pariah president of Guinea-Bissau. Those were the only heads of state who came. Either it shows that the Mozambican diplomacy is very low or very weak, or it's an important signal for all of us to understand that the other heads of state did not feel comfortable to be witnessing a president who came through fraudulent means. In that sense, I think that those heads of state, I would like to commend them because they stood up to their principles. I don't know if that was the reason why they did not come, but at least it sends a positive signal to the region that if you rig elections, your counterparts may not attend your inauguration. I hope that institutions like SAPES, like SAPES, like SIA, like Brentahurst Foundation and so on should engage more, and think tanks and intellectuals should continue being the leading factor, and not waiting for the problem to arise, for the problem to erupt. But this conversation even before the election. So this is my recommendation to SAPES. I think we would have organized this before the elections because the signals were all there. So we need to wake up the politicians and other actors about the challenges of governance in our region. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Muito
thank you very much to the
Manuel, muito obrigado. You've been excellent. On that note, I think that the dialogue continues, the discussions on Mozambique continue, and that it's not too late. You made the point very clear that it's not too late. And I know that you and Agostino, and among others, have been very busy over the last few months. We urge you not to give up. And I think I feel hopeful. From the discussion today, I feel very hopeful that there is something happening in Mozambique, that we will come through eventually. But thank you very much. And if you can, when you have time, Emmanuel, make the kind of summary you made last time, so we can take it further in terms of publishing it and having a discussion next time on the same subject. Muito obrigado. Thank you very much, Manuel, Sophie, Greg, and Agostino. Thank you very much.